Welcome to Fright Fables. Before we start, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you're enjoying the journey, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin. Alright, so this happened a few months back, and I still get chills just thinking about it. I was working a late shift, closing up after what felt like an endless night. You know how it goes. Half the customers barely make it out the door on their own. And then there's always one last straggler who just won't take the hint. This time, it was a guy I didn't recognize, but he seemed harmless enough at first. Mid-30s, kinda scruffy, like he'd been out all night. He was nursing his drink, quiet, keeping to himself, so I didn't pay him much attention. But the clock was ticking and I was ready to wrap up, so I went over and told him we were closing. "Just finishing up," he said, giving me this tired smile. But something about his eyes, I don't know, they seemed a little too intense, like he was reading into me or something. I did my usual closing routine, wiping down tables, stacking chairs, but every time I glanced over, he was still there, swirling his drink slowly, watching me like he had nowhere else to be. It was just us by then. The other bartenders had already left, and it was dead quiet. I kept trying to hint that it was time to go, flipping lights, grabbing my bag, locking up bottles behind the bar, but he just stayed put. Finally, I decided to be direct. "Hey, we're closed, man. You need to head out." That's when he smiled, a slow, creepy kind of smile. He didn't get up, didn't even budge. He just looked at me and said, "What's the rush?" "We've got all night." My stomach did this little flip, and suddenly I was very aware of how empty the place was, how isolated it felt. I forced a laugh, trying to keep it light, but he could tell I was tense. He leaned back, stretching his arms across the bar like he owned the place. I walked over to the front door, figuring I'd just open it and, motion for him to leave. But when I grabbed the handle, it wouldn't budge. I looked down, and sure enough, the lock was engaged. Now I know for a fact I didn't lock that door. I always leave it unlocked until I'm ready to walk out myself. I turned back, trying to play it cool, but he was already standing up, a little too close for comfort. "Door's locked, huh?" he murmured, like he knew exactly what he was doing. "Guess you're stuck with me now." I felt my pulse race, my hands clenching without even thinking about it. I kept my tone casual, though my voice shook just a bit. "All right, joke's over. I need you to leave." He just stared, that smile never fading. "Oh, come on. I thought we were just getting to know each other. Don't you like your job? All alone, after hours. Seems like you're into this." My heart was pounding, and every instinct in my body screamed to run. But he was blocking the way to the door, and there was no other way out except the back, which was always locked from the outside. I took a small step back, trying not to let him see the panic in my eyes. Then he reached into his jacket, and I swear I thought he was pulling out a weapon. But instead he pulled out his phone and started typing something. I didn't dare take my eyes off him. Not for a second. Finally he looked up, holding the phone toward me. "Smile," he said, and snapped a photo. That was it for me. I bolted behind the bar, grabbing the heaviest thing I could find. A bottle of whiskey, fingers gripping the neck so tight I thought I'd break it. He laughed, not even flinching. "Oh, now you're gonna play rough? I didn't think you had it in you." I felt trapped, completely helpless, but I kept my voice steady. "If you don't leave right now, I'll call the cops." He tilted his head, like he was considering it. Then he put his hands up, all mock innocence. All right, no need to get violent." But instead of heading toward the door, he stepped back, locking eyes with me as he slowly reached out and twisted the lock on the door himself. "Just remember," he said, voice low, "I know where you work." And then he walked out, whistling, like this was all some sick game. I stood there, hands shaking, barely able to breathe until I heard the lock click behind him. I grabbed my phone, checking for his photo, but it wasn't there. Nothing he'd done seemed to have left a trace. Ever since that night, every time I work a late shift, I catch myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking around, waiting for last call. Working late wasn't exactly my favorite thing to do, but the receptionist job paid well enough and I needed the extra hours. I was sitting at the front desk wrapping up for the night when the phone rang. It was almost 10 p.m., and everyone else had already left. I remember glancing at the clock thinking, who's calling this late? I picked up the receiver, and a guy on the other end introduced himself as Tony from maintenance. He had a casual tone, said something about needing to send someone over to check on a broken door in the back, and asked if I could stay behind to let the repairman in. It sounded legit. I'd gotten calls like this before, and the building was old, so things broke down all the time. Sure, I said, not really thinking much of it. He thanked me, said the guy would be there in about 10 minutes, and hung up. I went back to scrolling through my phone, waiting. Sure enough, about 10 minutes later, a guy walked in wearing a jumpsuit, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes and carrying a toolbox. He gave me a quick nod and mumbled, "Here for the door." I smiled politely, even though something about him felt off. Maybe it was how he avoided eye contact or how his hands fidgeted with the toolbox handle, like he was nervous. But I brushed it off. People are weird sometimes, right? I led him toward the back, where the supposed broken door was. He didn't say much as we walked, just the occasional grunt or nod when I pointed things out. The hallway lights flickered, casting these weird shadows on the walls, and I felt this creeping unease settling in. I told myself I was just being paranoid. It was late, and the building always felt a little creepy after hours. When we got to the door, I pointed at it. "This one, right?" He didn't answer right away, just stared at the door for a few seconds before muttering, "Yeah." Then he set his toolbox down and started fumbling with the doorknob. I stood there, waiting, but after a few minutes, he still hadn't done anything. He wasn't even really looking at the door, just sort of hovering. "You okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He turned and gave me this weird smile, like he was trying to be friendly, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Yeah, just gonna need a bit longer." Something in my gut twisted. I'd been in enough sketchy situations to know when something wasn't right. I took a step back, glancing at the door. "Do you need me to call someone? Maybe Tony? Make sure we're fixing the right thing?" The guy's smile faded. "No need for that. I've got it." He said it with such finality that it made my skin crawl. I started to back up, my hand reaching for my phone in my pocket. "Well, I've got to head back up front," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just, let me know when you're done." As I turned to leave, I noticed something. He wasn't working on the door at all. He was fiddling with the lock, but not in a way that made sense. It looked like he was jamming it, like he was deliberately trying to make it so the door wouldn't open. My stomach dropped. I walked faster, not wanting to let on that I was freaked out. When I got back to the front desk, I dialed the number for maintenance, hoping to get a hold of Tony and confirm what the hell was going on. But when the line picked up, it wasn't Tony on the other end. It was a voicemail. "We're sorry, the maintenance office is closed. Please call back during regular business hours." My heart started racing. If the maintenance office was closed, who the hell had I been talking to earlier? That's when I heard footsteps coming up the hall behind me. Slow, deliberate. The guy was heading my way. I hung up the phone and grabbed my keys, fumbling to unlock the front door. But when I turned the knob, it wouldn't budge. The door was locked from the inside. What the hell? I tried again, harder this time, but the door was jammed. I spun around, my pulse thundering in my ears just as the repairman stepped into the lobby. His eyes were darker now, the friendly facade gone. He set his toolbox down, slowly, like he had all the time in the world. "You going somewhere?" he asked, his voice low, almost mocking. Fear hit me hard and I backed away, my eyes darting around the room for another way out. The back exits were down the hall, but if he'd sabotaged the front, there was no telling what he'd done back there. I swallowed hard, trying to think. "What do you want?" My voice shook, but I didn't care. I just needed to buy time. He smiled that creepy smile again. "Just to chat. Maybe a bit more, depends on how you behave." My mind was racing. This guy wasn't here to fix anything. He'd come here to trap me. I could feel the panic rising, but I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be another way out. Then I remembered the side door in the stairwell. I hadn't used it in months, but it might still work. I glanced toward the hallway, weighing my chances. He was blocking the main door, but if I made a break for it, I might be able to outrun him. Without another word, I bolted. I heard him shout behind me, followed by the sound of his boots pounding against the tile as he gave chase. I sprinted down the hallway, my legs burning as I pushed myself faster than I thought possible. The stairwell door was just ahead. I slammed into it, throwing it open and rushing down the stairs. The side door was at the bottom, but when I reached it, I realized with horror that he'd jammed that one too. The lock was busted just like the front door. I spun around, breathing hard. He was coming down the stairs slowly now, like he knew I had nowhere to go. His smile was gone, replaced by something darker, more dangerous. Trapped, my mind raced for a solution. And then, an idea hit me. The fire alarm. Without hesitating, I reached up and pulled it, the loud, shrill ring echoing through the stairwell. The sprinklers overhead sputtered to life, spraying water everywhere. His smug expression faltered for just a second, and that was all I needed. While he was distracted, I shoved past him, running back up the stairs and into the lobby. The fire alarm had automatically unlocked the doors, standard building protocol. I didn't look back as I shoved the front door open and ran out into the night, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, hands trembling as I fumbled for my keys. I got in, slammed the door, and locked it. My breath was ragged, my body soaked from the sprinklers, but I didn't care. I was alive. I called the police and they came fast, but when they searched the building, the guy was gone. No trace of him, no toolbox, nothing, but I know what I saw and I know he'll be back for someone else. Guests come and go. That's how it works in this business. You check in, you sleep, you check out. Simple. Except sometimes people don't check out, and sometimes they don't leave at all. It started with room 304. I was working the graveyard shift, covering for my manager. The motel was quiet. Only a few guests, mostly truckers and business types. I was going through the check-ins from the past week when I noticed something weird. A man named Daniel Foster had checked in 5 days ago. No problem there, except the system never showed him checking out. His reservation was only for 2 nights, but his car was still in the lot, and no one had seen him since. I called housekeeping. Did anyone clean 304 this week? There was a pause on the other end. Then, a hesitant, no, the do not disturb sign has been up since Monday. 5 days. I hung up, grabbed the master key, and headed upstairs. The hall was silent. I stopped in front of 304. The do not disturb sign still hung on the handle, faded from days of exposure. I knocked anyway. "Sir?" My voice echoed down the empty hall. "Front desk, just checking in." Nothing. Another knock, louder. No answer. My stomach tightened. I slid the key into the lock and turned the handle. The door swung open, and the smell hit me first. Rot. Not like a dead body. I'd smelled that before. This was different, like rotting food. Spoiled meat. Something that had been sitting in the heat for days. The room was dark. The blackout curtains were still shut. I reached for the light switch and froze. On the desk by the window sat a wallet, a phone, a laptop, all untouched. His luggage was still in the corner, neatly zipped. His shoes by the bed, side by side, like he had just slipped them off before lying down. But there was no sign of him. No messy sheets. No clothes in the bathroom. Nothing. Just an empty room. And that rotting smell. I took a step back, my heart hammering. I reached for my radio. Then I heard it. A creak. Coming from the closet. I turned and saw the door crack open. Just an inch. A breath of cold air slipped out, curling around my ankles like a draft from an open freezer. I swallowed hard, reaching for the handle. I yanked the door open. Nothing. Empty. just a closet. But the smell was stronger now. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat, and then I saw the security chain, still locked from the inside. That didn't make sense. If Daniel had left the room, he would have had to undo the chain. But it was still latched shut, like he had locked himself in and never came out. I backed out, slammed the door shut, and booked it to the lobby. Called the police, told them we had a missing guest. They arrived 20 minutes later, checked the room, and found nothing. No body, no sign of struggle, no proof that Daniel Foster had ever slept there at all. Just an empty room, and security footage that showed him entering, but never leaving. A few days later, a new guest checked into 304, a businesswoman traveling alone. She checked out the next morning, pale and shaky. She didn't say much, just handed me her key and muttered, "There's something wrong with that room." I didn't ask questions, but later that night, as I reviewed the security footage, I saw something else. A blurry shape standing by the closet door, tall, thin, just barely visible in the corner of the frame, watching, waiting. And right before the woman left the room, the closet door creaked open, just an inch, like it was letting her go. Daniel Foster was never found. The cops ruled it as voluntary disappearance. Said maybe he wanted to start over. But I know better, because sometimes when I pass room 304, I swear I can still smell it, that rotting stench. And when I listen close enough, I hear the closet door creak. I'm not big on conspiracy theories or urban legends, but this one still gives me chills. I grew up hearing bits and pieces of the story, snippets my parents and neighbors whispered around campfires. It always felt like one of those exaggerated tales people tell to spook kids, but when I got older, I decided to dig into it myself. What I found? Well, it's hard to forget. It happened back in 1995. A family from Denver, a mom, dad, and their 2 kids, decided to take a winter vacation in the Rockies. They booked a week at a remote snow lodge, the kind of place that doesn't even pop up on travel websites. It was run by locals, quiet, secluded, with a reputation for incredible views and deep powder skiing. Perfect for a family getaway. The last time anyone saw them was the day before their departure. The lodge owner, an older guy named Henry, had chatted with the dad about the snow conditions and how the family had loved their stay. Nothing out of the ordinary. They were set to leave the next morning, but they didn't. When the lodge's cleaning staff arrived later that day to prep the rooms for new guests, they found the place off. The family's rental SUV was still in the driveway, snow piled up on the windshield. Inside, the lodge was eerily quiet. No laughter from the kids, no suitcases packed by the door. Just silence. The first thing that stood out was breakfast. Plates of eggs and pancakes were still sitting on the dining table, half-eaten, with steam faintly visible in the freezing air. It was as if the family and staff had vanished mid-meal. Jackets hung by the door, boots were neatly lined up, and personal belongings were scattered as if the day was just starting. But there wasn't a single person in sight. The cleaning crew called the local sheriff, who brought a team up to investigate. They scoured the lodge, every room, every closet, every crawl space. Nothing. The family wasn't there. Neither were the staff members who had been staying on site. 5 in total. Outside, search teams found tracks in the snow, leading away from the lodge and into the woods. At first, they thought it might be a planned hike gone wrong. But here's where it gets strange. The tracks weren't hurried or chaotic. They were neat, deliberate, as if everyone had calmly walked into the forest together. And then, about 200 yards in, they stopped. Just stopped. No signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, just an empty expanse of untouched snow, as if they'd all vanished into thin air. The rescue effort became a full-scale operation. Helicopters, dogs, volunteers, you name it. Days turned into weeks, but they didn't find a single clue. No bodies, no clothing, no signs of life. It was like the mountain had swallowed them whole. That would have been weird enough, but the locals had their own theories. Stories about the lodge's land being cursed. Some said it was sacred to the Ute tribe, and that building on it had angered the spirits. Others whispered about old rituals tied to the area, something about sacrifices to appease the mountain and ensure safe winters. One of the eeriest details? The lodge had no official records, no deeds, no permits, nothing. It had been there for decades, but no one seemed to know who built it or who truly owned it. When reporters tried to dig deeper, they hit dead ends, literally. The story was buried, overshadowed by other news, and the lodge was left to rot. About 10 years later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the lodge. It was still standing, though barely. The windows were shattered, the roof caved in. Nature had reclaimed most of it. They ventured inside and found it exactly as the sheriff's team had described. Plates still on the table, furniture covered in dust but undisturbed. One of the hikers claimed to hear faint laughter coming from the woods, but by then, the group was too spooked to stay. The lodge was demolished in the early 2000s, but the land remains untouched. Locals say animals won't go near it, that the area is always eerily quiet. Some even claim to see lights in the woods at night moving in patterns that don't make sense. I visited the site once, just to see for myself. It was years after the demolition, but you could still feel it. The weight in the air, like the land itself was holding its breath. The ground felt wrong under my boots, soft in places where it shouldn't have been. I didn't stick around long. Sometimes I think about that family and the staff. What could have made them all leave so calmly? Was it fear? Something else? I don't know. And maybe I don't want to. But every now and then, when the wind howls outside my window at night, I can almost hear it. The faint, distant echo of footsteps in the snow. It was a typical Friday night, the kind of busy where you barely have a moment to breathe. The bar was packed, music blaring, people laughing and talking over each other. I was in my zone, pouring drinks, cracking jokes, doing my usual routine. But then I spotted him, a guy in a police uniform standing near the entrance. Now, cops swing by sometimes, you know? Check on things, make sure the crowd's not getting too rowdy. But this guy, something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He was young, maybe early 30s, but had this weird, over-friendly vibe, like he was trying too hard. And instead of staying by the entrance or talking to security, he was wandering around, eyeing people up. I didn't think much of it at first, kept pouring drinks, doing my thing. But then he started approaching customers, asking to see their IDs. At first, I figured he was just checking if they were of age, maybe trying to bust someone for a fake ID. But he wasn't asking everyone, just certain people. Mostly women, actually. And it wasn't in any official kind of way. He'd lean in close, all friendly, sometimes even touching their shoulder like he knew them. After a while, he came up to the bar, flashed a smile at me, and asked for a water. I got him one, just trying to keep things cool, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The whole time he was scanning the room, like he was looking for someone specific. Then out of nowhere, he starts escorting people out. He'd pick one person, ask them to follow him, and lead them out through the back. At first, I thought maybe he'd caught someone doing something illegal, but he didn't seem to be arresting anyone, just leading them away, one by one. And each time he'd come back in, calm as anything, and start scoping out the crowd again. Something inside me just started screaming that this wasn't right. I went over to my manager, quietly pulled him aside, and told him what I was seeing. He glanced over at the officer, his expression shifting from confusion to concern. "That guy doesn't look familiar," he muttered, which was weird because we all knew the local cops by now. We decided to do a little digging. My manager went into the back to call the police station and verify if they'd sent anyone. Meanwhile, I kept an eye on our mystery cop. By now, he'd found another target, a young woman sitting alone, waiting for her friends. He leaned down, talking to her with this weird, overly friendly smile, and she looked uncomfortable, glancing around as if she didn't know what to do. I walked over, pretending to clean up nearby, and caught a bit of their conversation. He was telling her that there had been some reports of suspicious activity in the area and that he needed to ask her a few questions outside. She seemed hesitant, looking around like she was hoping someone would step in. That's when I cleared my throat and said, "Hey, you all right?" The guy looked at me, his smile fading just a bit. "It's fine," he said a little too firmly. "Just routine questioning." But I wasn't buying it. "Funny," I replied, trying to keep my tone light. "Because we didn't get a heads up about any police checks tonight." He gave me a hard look, and for a second I swear I thought he was going to snap. But then he just plastered that smile back on and said, "Just doing my job." Right then my manager came back out, his face pale. He pulled me aside and whispered, "I called the station. They didn't send anyone." That was all I needed to hear. I walked straight up to the guy and said, "I think you need to leave." The room went quiet, a few people watching us, sensing the tension. The guy stared at me, his eyes narrowing, but he didn't argue. He just turned and started walking toward the door. But as he passed, he leaned in close to me, so close I could feel his breath on my ear, and whispered, "You have no idea what you just did." And then he was gone, disappearing into the night before we could stop him. We called the real cops after that, gave them a description and told them everything. But by the time they got there, he was long gone. They checked the security footage, took our statements, but they didn't sound too optimistic about catching him. They said he probably wasn't even a real cop, just someone who'd bought a uniform online and decided to play a twisted game. For weeks after that, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see him lurking somewhere, watching me with that dead-eyed smile. I'll never forget that night, or the feeling that somehow he wasn't done, that he'd be back looking for someone else to escort out into the darkness. People complain about the temperature all the time. The AC's too cold. The heater's too weak. It's usually just an old vent system or guests being dramatic. But that night, the night room 117 froze over. I knew something was wrong. It started with a phone call. I was working the night shift, zoning out at the front desk when the phone buzzed. "Front desk," I said. A man's voice came through, shaky. "Hey, something's wrong with the heater." I checked the system. "You're in 117, right?" "Yeah, I cranked it up, but it's still freezing in here." "Let me send someone up." He hesitated. "Number? It's fine. I'll just use the blankets." I shrugged. If he didn't want maintenance, it wasn't my problem. That was at 1:13 a.m. By morning, he was dead. Housekeeping found him, curled under the blankets, lips blue, skin stiff with frost, like he had frozen to death in his sleep. The heater? It was running perfectly. I stood there as the paramedics wheeled him out, my stomach a knot of ice. I had talked to him hours ago, and now he was gone. That should have been the end of it. But then we checked the security footage. I fast-forwarded to 1:13 a.m. There he was, pacing his room, rubbing his hands together for warmth. The heater was on full blast, but he kept shivering. Then, at 1:17 a.m., something changed. The screen flickered, and suddenly he was staring at the door, like he had just heard something. His breath curled in the air. I leaned in. Something moved at the edge of the screen. The thermostat dial. It was turning, on its own. Lower, lower, until it hit 0. He scrambled for the dial, twisting it back up, but it wouldn't move. Then the lights flickered, and I swear to God, something stepped into the room. It was just a shadow at first, a sliver of darkness curling out from the vent. Then it grew, stretched, until it took the shape of a tall, thin figure. The man backed up, his breath coming in sharp, frantic gasps. Frost crawled up the walls, the windows iced over. Then the screen glitched, and when it cleared, he was in bed, curled under the blankets, completely still, like something had just put him there. The camera froze at 1:23 a.m. The last thing it showed? The frost-covered mirror, and written across the glass in shaky, frozen letters, "Don't let it in. Room 117 is permanently closed now. The heater works fine in every other room, just not that one. And every time I pass it, I swear I feel it. A breath of cold air creeping under the door." I've worked as a janitor in a corporate office building for about 5 years now. And most nights it's a routine job. Empty offices, flickering fluorescent lights, and the hum of vending machines in break rooms. It's not glamorous, but it's quiet. And quiet is what I like. One night, though, things didn't go quite as planned. It was the end of my shift, around 11 p.m., and I was finishing up in the lobby. The place was empty, as always. I was sweeping up by the front doors, getting ready to leave, when I heard a faint beep from the security panel. That was my cue. The automatic security system was about to activate. Normally, I'm out the door before it kicks in, but I guess I lost track of time that night. I glanced at the clock and cursed under my breath, just 5 minutes too late. I made a mad dash for the exit, but the doors had already locked with a loud metallic click. The lights dimmed, leaving the building bathed in shadows. "Great," I muttered. I wasn't too worried. This wasn't the first time I'd gotten stuck inside after hours. The security system could be a pain, but all I had to do was call my supervisor, and she'd unlock the doors remotely. No big deal. But when I pulled out my phone, I noticed something odd. No signal. Not a single bar. That was strange, considering I'd always had service in the building. I shrugged it off, figuring it was just a fluke, and walked over to the office phone at the front desk. When I picked it up, though, the line was dead. No dial tone. Nothing. Weird, I thought, trying to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. There had to be another way to get out. I figured I'd head down to the basement and try the service entrance. The stairs leading down were at the back of the building, near the storage rooms, and I was pretty sure that door didn't lock with the rest of the building. I grabbed my flashlight from the janitor's closet just in case. The basement wasn't exactly well lit, even on a good night. As I started walking down the long hallway toward the stairs, the lights flickered. Not just once, but several times, plunging the corridor into brief bursts of darkness. I froze, listening. That's when I heard it. Heavy breathing. Slow, deliberate, and close. Too close. I whipped around, shining my flashlight down the hallway, but there was nothing there. Just shadows stretching out along the walls. My heart started pounding in my chest. I knew I was the only one in the building. I had checked every floor before heading to the lobby. So where was the breathing coming from? The lights flickered again, and I swear I heard footsteps. Not the soft shuffle of shoes, but heavy, deliberate steps echoing down the hall. I gripped the flashlight tighter, feeling the weight of it in my hand. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe one of the security guys was messing with me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I hurried toward the basement stairs, my footsteps echoing louder than they should have in the quiet building. Every step felt like a lifetime, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. When I finally reached the stairwell, I felt a brief moment of relief. I pushed open the door and headed down the narrow staircase, the air growing colder with each step. The basement was even darker than usual, the lights overhead flickering sporadically. I shone my flashlight around, scanning the concrete walls and storage rooms. Everything seemed normal. Boxes stacked high, old office furniture, cleaning supplies. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something that didn't belong. There was a door I had never seen before, tucked away in the farthest corner of the basement. It was old, older than the rest of the building by the looks of it, made of thick, rusted metal, with a heavy lock bolted across the front. I stood there for a moment, staring at it. I'd worked here for 5 years and had never noticed that door. The building wasn't that big, and I knew the layout by heart, so how could I have missed it? Curiosity got the better of me. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight beam flickering across the rough surface. As I got closer, I noticed something else. Scratches. Deep, jagged scratches all over the metal, like someone, or something, had tried to claw their way out. A cold chill ran down my spine. I knelt down, running my fingers over the lock. It was old, rusted, and looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But something about the door felt wrong, like it was hiding something dangerous. I stood up, my hand shaking as I gripped the flashlight. I should have walked away, I knew that. I should have turned around and gone back upstairs, but I couldn't. There was something about that door that pulled me in, like it wanted to be opened. Just as I reached for the lock, I heard it again. Heavy breathing. This time, it was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the basement, but there was no one there. The footsteps echoed louder, closer, as if they were circling me. Then the power cut out completely. I was plunged into total darkness. My flashlight flickered weakly, the beam barely cutting through the thick blackness. Panic set in, my heart pounding in my chest. I had to get out. I didn't care about the door or what was behind it anymore. I just wanted to leave. But as I turned to head back to the stairs, the door behind me creaked open. I froze. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see what was inside. But something compelled me to turn around, to shine my light on the now open door. The room beyond was pitch black, but I could feel something there. Something watching me. The air was thick with a damp, musty smell, like the inside of a tomb. And then I saw it. 2 glowing eyes staring back at me from the darkness. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted, running faster than I ever thought possible, up the stairs, through the flickering hallway, and toward the lobby. I didn't stop until I reached the front doors. The moment I reached the lobby, the lights flickered back on. The power returned and the doors unlocked with a soft click. I didn't look back. I didn't care what had been in that basement, or why the door had opened on its own. I just ran. I never told anyone what I saw until now. I still have lingering PTSD whenever I'm in an office building alone late at night. I don't know why I'm writing this down. Maybe it's to convince myself that what I heard wasn't real, or maybe it's because I can't stop thinking about it. The voice, the trail, and the ranger's warning I almost ignored. The first time I heard the story, I was on a weekend trip to a national park with my buddy Luke. We'd rented a couple of cabins, stocked up on snacks and beer, and planned to hike some of the lesser-known trails to avoid the crowds. Luke had been to the park before and swore by this one old trail called Lost Hollow. He said it was practically abandoned now, but the views were worth it. When we checked in at the ranger station, the guy behind the desk, graying hair, kind of gruff, paused when Luke mentioned Lost Hollow. He leaned forward like he was about to let us in on some big secret. "You ever hear about the ranger who disappeared up there?" he asked. I shook my head, but Luke nodded. "You mean the guy from the 80s? They found his stuff, but never him, right?" "Yeah," the ranger said, his voice low. "They say he went up to check out some reports, people hearing voices, weird sounds. His notebook was the only clue they found. Said something about not following the voice. Creepy, huh?" Luke laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the look in the ranger's eyes. It wasn't like he was telling a ghost story to scare tourists. It was more like he was warning us. We hit the trail the next morning just as the sun was coming up. At first it was amazing. Quiet, peaceful, not another soul in sight. The kind of solitude you can only get deep in the woods. But the farther we went, the more unsettling it felt. It started with the whispers. At first I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees, but then I realized it was too deliberate, too human. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman. Her voice faint and melodic, drifting through the air. "Did you hear that?" I asked Luke. "Hear what?" he said, turning around. The whispering stopped. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, but shrugged it off. Nothing, just the wind, I guess. We kept going, but the feeling of being watched never went away. Every so often I'd hear branches snapping behind us, like someone, or something, was following. Luke didn't seem to notice, which only made it worse. By the time we reached the halfway point, I was ready to turn back. That's when we heard her. "Help me." It was a woman's voice, faint but desperate, coming from somewhere off the trail. I froze, my heart pounding. Luke looked at me, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. "Yeah," I said, "but we shouldn't." "Hello?" The voice called again, a little louder this time. "Please, I'm lost." Luke started toward the sound, but I grabbed his arm. "Wait," I said. "Remember what the ranger said about the notebook?" "Come on, man," he said, shaking me off. "What if someone's actually in trouble?" I wanted to argue, but another voice stopped me. It was a man this time, low and clear, coming from somewhere behind us. "Don't follow her voice." Luke froze. What the hell was that? I turned around, my stomach twisting into knots. There was no one there, just the trees and the shadows stretching across the trail. The woman's voice called out again, closer now. "Please, I need help." Luke hesitated, his eyes darting between me and the woods. I could see the conflict on his face. He didn't want to ignore someone who might be in danger, but he also couldn't explain the other voice we just heard. "We need to go," I said firmly. "But now." I grabbed his arm and started back down the trail, half expecting him to resist. To my relief, he followed. The whispers didn't stop. If anything, they got louder, more insistent, like they were trying to lure us back. The woman's voice shifted, growing sharper, angrier. "Don't leave me," she screamed. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. Standing in the distance just off the trail was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but it was clearly a woman. Her head tilted at an unnatural angle, her arms hanging limply at her sides. She didn't move, but the voice grew louder, echoing in my ears. "Come back!" I ran. By the time we reached the trailhead, I was gasping for air, my legs trembling. Luke was right behind me, his face pale and drenched in sweat. Neither of us said a word as we got into the car and drove back to the cabin. It wasn't until we were safely inside, with the doors locked and the blinds drawn, that Luke finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" I didn't have an answer. We left the park the next morning, cutting our trip short. On the way out, I spotted the ranger from before, standing outside the station. He gave me a knowing look, like he didn't need to ask what had happened. I've thought about that day a lot since then, replaying every moment in my head. Part of me wonders if we imagined the whole thing, if it was just the wind and our overactive imaginations. But then I remember the figure in the woods, the voice that warned us, and the words scrawled in that missing ranger's notebook. Don't follow her voice. She's not human. I don't think I'll ever step foot in that park again. I had just closed up for the night, locking the front door, finally ready to leave when I heard it. A sharp crack like glass breaking coming from the back storage area. At first I thought maybe it was something falling off a shelf or a broken bottle, but this was different. This was deliberate. I froze, my hand on my phone, not even sure if I should call anyone yet. I was alone, and every shadow in that empty bar suddenly felt alive. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, steady footsteps moving through the back hallway where we kept the liquor in storage. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure anyone within a mile could hear it. I debated just bolting out the front door, but something kept me rooted in place. Call it shock or stupidity, but I stayed there, gripping my phone, waiting. The footsteps grew closer, creeping along as if the person was taking their time. They weren't in any hurry. I slipped behind the bar, ducking down, peeking out just enough to watch the hallway. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I didn't want to make a sound, but I also didn't want to sit there completely defenseless. I kept trying to convince myself to call the police, but I was terrified he'd hear the click of the buttons. Just then the footsteps stopped, dead silent. I held my breath, straining to hear any sign of movement. I couldn't see the back hallway from where I was hiding, but I could sense him there, just out of sight, listening, maybe wondering if anyone was around. Suddenly I heard something scrape across the floor. I couldn't see what he was doing, but I had this awful image of him dragging something heavy. I gripped the handle of a nearby wine opener, the only weapon I had within reach. though I knew it wouldn't do much against whatever might be out there. Then, he started muttering. Just this low, barely audible whisper like he was talking to himself. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough to send a chill down my spine. I could tell he was moving again, slowly, methodically, coming toward the bar. I pressed myself as close to the cabinets as I could, feeling like a trapped animal with nowhere to go. As he approached, he paused again. I could just make out the sound of him breathing, heavy, labored breaths that echoed slightly against the walls. My mind was racing, playing out scenarios, each one worse than the last. I wanted to bolt, to make a run for the door, but every inch of my body felt locked in place. Finally, I heard him step into the main bar area, just out of my line of sight. All it would take was one more step and he'd see me. I shut my eyes, half waiting for him to grab me, to yank me out from behind the bar. But instead, he stopped. I could feel him standing there just a few feet away, still breathing that heavy, ragged breath. And then he spoke, low and eerie, like he was speaking to himself, but loud enough for me to hear. "I know you're here. I can feel it." My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to do anything but sit there in silence, but I couldn't make a sound. My throat felt tight, like I was choking on my own fear. He took a step forward, his boots scuffing against the floor, and then another. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, but I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. He circled the bar, pausing now and then like he was taking in every detail. I saw his shadow stretching over me, long and ominous, and I bit down hard, hoping he wouldn't actually look down. After what felt like an eternity, he moved toward the cash register, rummaging around, taking his time. The sounds of his hands rifling through the drawers, the click of the register, every tiny noise felt magnified, echoing through the empty bar. My eyes darted to the front door. I didn't know if I could make it out without him seeing me, but I knew this was my best chance. He was distracted, and I had to move now or risk him catching me. I clutched my phone, pulling myself up slowly, inching toward the edge of the bar, keeping my movements small and silent. Just when I thought I was in the clear, I heard his footsteps, coming back around the bar. I ducked back down just in time, hearing him mutter something under his breath. It was like he was talking to someone, but there was no one else there. I felt this rising panic, realizing that he might not be alone after all, that there might be others lurking somewhere in the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out. With a deep breath, I crawled toward the end of the bar, praying he wouldn't notice. Just as I was about to make a break for it, I felt a sharp pain in my ankle. Something snagged my foot, and I fell forward, making a loud thud. The footsteps stopped. My heart was hammering, and I could hear him turn around. His breathing grew louder, closer. I scrambled up, yanking my foot free from whatever had caught it, and bolted for the door. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I reached the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the cool night air, running as fast as I could down the empty street. I didn't stop until I was far enough away that I couldn't hear anything behind me, until the bar was just a distant shadow. I called the police, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial. By the time they arrived, the intruder was gone. They found shattered glass, footprints, signs that someone had broken in, but no sign of him. They told me it might have been a random thief, but I knew, deep down, that it wasn't just a robbery. He knew I was there. He was looking for me. And I'll never forget that voice, that heavy, deliberate breathing as he circled the bar, knowing he was just inches away from finding me. I should have known something was off about him the second he walked in. Most of our guests at the Sunset Pines Motel were the usual kind: travelers, truckers, the occasional couple sneaking around. But this guy, he was different. He stepped into the lobby around midnight, looking over his shoulder like someone was following him. His clothes were damp from the snow, jeans torn at the knees, and his hands. They were shaking. "Need a room?" I asked. He nodded, glancing toward the parking lot. "Yeah, just for the night." I pulled up the system. "Name?" He hesitated, just for a second. James. No last name. That should have been my first red flag, but I didn't question it. People lied about their names all the time. Cheating spouses, people dodging bills, you name it. $52, I said, sliding the key across the counter. Room 209. Stairs are around the side. He snatched up the key and hurried out, not even waiting for a receipt. I didn't think much of it until the cops showed up the next morning. A cruiser pulled into the lot just after sunrise. 2 officers stepped out, faces tense. "Morning," I said, forcing a smile. "Something I can help you with?" One of them glanced toward the guest log. "We got a report of a body in the woods nearby." My stomach dropped. "A body?" He nodded. "Hiker found it this morning. Pretty torn up. Not an animal attack, though. Looks like something else." I swallowed. Jesus. "Anyone check in last night? Someone passing through?" My eyes drifted to the logbook. One guest, James. Room 209. The officer followed my gaze. "Mind if we take a look?" I grabbed the spare key, my hands cold despite the heater blasting behind the desk. Together we climbed the stairs. I knocked first. No answer. Knocked again. Nothing. The cop motioned for me to open the door. I slid the key into the lock, heart pounding. The second the door swung open, I knew something was wrong. The bed was untouched. No luggage, no toothbrush in the bathroom. Just empty. Like no one had ever stayed there. But the key was still inside. I turned to the officer, my pulse hammering. I don't get it. He checked in last night." The other officer scanned the room. "Surveillance?" I nodded. "We got cameras." Back in the lobby, I pulled up the security feed, fast-forwarded to midnight. There he was, James, stepping into the lobby, pacing, looking over his shoulder. I hit play. The officers leaned in. We watched him take the key, walk toward his room. Then, nothing. No movement. No one ever came back out. "Maybe he snuck out," I said, clicking through the footage. "Back exit, maybe." Then I froze. The parking lot camera. The second James walked across the lot, the footage glitched. Just static. And when the feed cleared, he was gone. Like he had just vanished into thin air. The officers left an hour later, but I never stopped thinking about it. A man checked into my motel. Used a fake name. Never checked out. And the next morning, a mutilated body was found in the woods. I never saw James again. But some nights, when the lot is empty and the halls are silent, I swear I hear footsteps in room 209, pacing, waiting. And when I check the cameras, the feed always glitches. You ever stumble across one of those stories that sticks with you even though it shouldn't? Like the kind of thing you hear late at night and brush off, but deep down, it just lingers. That's how it was for me with the place on Hollow Creek Drive. I first heard about it back in 2010, when I was working night shifts at a diner. It was one of those slow nights. Just me, the cook, and this regular named Pete who always came in for coffee and a slice of pie. We'd been chatting about urban legends when he brought it up. "You ever hear about the Hollow Creek complex?" he asked, stirring his coffee like he wasn't about to drop the most unsettling thing I'd ever heard. I shook my head. "What's that?" He leaned in like he didn't want anyone else to hear. "A whole apartment complex emptied out in one night. Everyone just gone." I laughed, thinking it was some ghost story to pass the time, but Pete didn't crack a smile. "They left everything behind," he continued. "Dinner's still on the tables, lights on, some showers running, like they just got up and walked out. Nobody saw a damn thing. And the weirdest part? They found a message in the hallway, 'We've gone home,' written in red paint." I shrugged it off, but something about the way he said it, like he wasn't just repeating a story, but remembering it, gave me the creeps. A few weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I had a day off, so I drove out to Hollow Creek. The building was gone, just an empty lot fenced off with no trespassing signs. But even in broad daylight, the place felt wrong. Like the air was heavier there and the silence wasn't just quiet, it was empty. I asked around and most people just rolled their eyes. Urban legend, one guy said. Some kids probably pulled a prank and it got blown out of proportion. But not everyone brushed it off. One woman, a retired teacher who lived down the street, told me she remembered the night it happened. It was the strangest thing, she said. I was grading papers, and around 10 p.m., I noticed all the lights in the complex were on. Every window was lit up. I thought maybe there was some kind of event, but it was so quiet. Too quiet. No music, no voices, nothing. Just this awful, heavy silence. I went to bed, and the next morning the lights were still on, but the parking lot was empty. I called the property manager, but she wouldn't say much, just that the residents were relocated. Relocated. Like that explained anything. I found an old news article about it online. Most of it was just speculation. Police didn't find any signs of foul play, and there were no reports of large vehicles or unusual activity that night. But the part that stood out was an interview with a neighbor who claimed they heard footsteps around 3 a.m., dozens of them marching in unison. The article also mentioned that the "We've gone home" message wasn't written in red paint like Pete said. It was blood. I wish I'd stopped there, but no, I had to keep digging. A few months later, I found out the lot had been sold to a developer who planned to build a shopping plaza. Construction had started, so I drove out to take a look. The workers didn't want to talk much, but one guy let something slip. "We keep hearing things," he said, lowering his voice. "Voices, footsteps, tools going missing, and the dirt, there's something wrong with it. It's too soft, like it's been disturbed." I asked if they'd found anything while digging, but he just shook his head. They won't tell us if they did. A few weeks later, the project was abandoned. No explanation, no follow-up, just a half-dug lot surrounded by chain-link fencing. I haven't been back since, but every now and then, I see something online. People claiming they hear voices when they drive past, or that their radios cut out near the site. I don't know if any of it's true, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened at Hollow Creek wasn't some urban legend. It was real. And whatever home those people went to, I hope to God it's nowhere near here. So I'm working this late shift at the bar one night. Pretty standard crowd, nothing out of the ordinary. It's close to midnight, and everyone's either having a good time or just getting that glazed over look after one too many. That's when I spot this guy at the corner of the bar. He's kind of off, just sitting alone, barely talking to anyone, watching everything. I mean, that's not entirely weird for a bar, but there's something unsettling about the way he's doing it. It's like he's not even part of the crowd, he's just observing, like he's looking for something. Anyway, I keep an eye on him, but I've got a lot of people to serve, so I'm running around, keeping busy. I start making a cocktail for this group of friends, turning my back for only a second, and when I turn back around, I see that same guy leaning over someone's drink. I mean, leaning in close, like he's messing with it. I've worked in bars long enough to know the signs of someone up to no good, and something about this just clicks all my instincts into overdrive. I try to stay calm, and I walk over casually, acting like I didn't just see him practically trying to slip something in her glass. "Hey, everything all right here?" I ask, trying to keep my tone light but firm. The guy just looks up at me, completely unfazed, like he's already thought through exactly how he's gonna react. He doesn't even flinch, just gives me this slow, unsettling grin. "Oh yeah, all good," he says, but his eyes, they're dead. No humor, no charm, just this empty stare that feels like it's cutting right through me. He straightens up and mutters something, but I'm too rattled to even catch it. The girl whose drink he was tampering with looks at me, confused, and I quietly tell her to order something else and to keep an eye on her drink. She looks freaked out, but she nods and moves back to her friends, thankfully oblivious to the full weirdness of the situation. Now, I'm stuck, wondering what to do. I mean, I could call security or tell him to leave, but I'm suddenly very aware of how he's staring at me. He doesn't leave. He just goes back to his seat and orders another drink as if nothing happened. Every few minutes I catch him looking at me, and it's this cold, unblinking gaze that makes me feel like I'm the one under scrutiny. I start to feel like I'm the one in danger here. So closing time finally rolls around, and I'm relieved when he heads out without a fuss. I breathe a sigh of relief, thinking maybe he was just trying to mess with me. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time I'd had to deal with creeps in this job. But as I'm cleaning up, my stomach sinks. I see him through the bar's front window. He's standing outside, just waiting. I try to ignore it, finish my tasks as quickly as I can, hoping he'll get bored and leave. But every time I glance out there, he's still there, staring straight at the door. There's this sick feeling in my gut, and I decide to wait it out, thinking he'll eventually give up. But it's been almost 30 minutes and he hasn't budged an inch. I start to realize he's not going anywhere. So I call one of my coworkers who was on an earlier shift, ask him to come back and walk me to my car. While I'm waiting, I keep looking out, and this guy is just motionless, almost statue-like. It's eerie. I'm starting to feel trapped, like there's nowhere to go that he won't see me. When my coworker finally arrives, the guy outside shifts a little, but he doesn't leave. He just turns to look at us both, like he's sizing up my coworker now too. My friend walks me out, trying to make light conversation, probably to distract me, but all I can think about is that guy. He's watching me the entire way to my car, his eyes tracking every step, that same unsettling smile creeping back onto his face. As we get to my car, my coworker mutters, "Creepy as hell, man, let's just go." I don't need any more encouragement. I jump into my car and we drive off. But the whole way, I'm paranoid, checking my rearview mirror constantly. I don't see him following, but that doesn't bring much comfort. Over the next few days, I kept seeing him in random places, the grocery store near my apartment building, and even at a coffee shop I go to before my shifts. He's not doing anything, just lurking, watching. Every time I spot him, he just stares, with that same unnerving smile, as if he's amused by how uncomfortable he's making me. Finally, I decided to confront him. I mean, maybe he's just trying to scare me and will back off if I call him out. So one night I walk up to him outside my apartment building, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want?" He just smiles, that dead, empty smile that never reaches his eyes. "Just wanted to make sure you remembered me," he says with a hint of amusement. Then he leans in, close enough that I can smell his cologne, and whispers, "You didn't stop me from what I came to do." And then just like that, he turns and walks away, like he's had his fun. I stand there, frozen, replaying his words, trying to make sense of it. But there's nothing. No explanation, no closure, just that creeping horror that he's still out there, somewhere, watching, waiting. I don't know what he meant, and I'm not sure I want to. I only know that from that night on, I kept a knife under my pillow, checked every lock, every night, and still never felt safe. It's been months, and I haven't seen him again, but it's like he left a mark on me. This paranoia, this sense that he's always just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to come back. Alright, so this one night I'm working a late shift at the bar. It's nearing last call and the place is thinning out, leaving just a few lingering customers, mostly the rowdy types who won't take the hint to go home. There's this group of guys near the back booth. They've been drinking pretty heavily, laughing way too loud, you know the type. Usually I'd ignore it, but tonight something felt off. As I'm cleaning up the bar, I hear snatches of their conversation. They're talking about a bet. Normally I'd tune it out, but one of them lowers his voice and suddenly I hear my name. That's enough to make me freeze, hands mid-wipe on a glass. "Think they'd go for it?" one of them mutters, glancing toward me. "Nah, no way, too smart for that, but if we push it?" Another one laughs, and it's not a friendly laugh. More like they're talking about a prank or something, but there's an edge to it. Then, the biggest guy of the group, some guy with a beard down to his chest, leans back and looks right at me, like he's sizing me up. I try to stay calm, brushing it off as drunk talk. But as the clock ticks closer to closing, they don't move. The place empties out, but they're still there watching me. I can feel their eyes following me every time I walk past. When I finally announce last call, they ignore me, just waving their glasses in the air like they own the place. I'm getting this sinking feeling, but I'm stuck. Gotta finish my shift. Finally, I walk over and tell them we're closed. They look at each other, smirking. The bearded guy leans forward, voice low. "How about a little wager, huh?" His tone's playful, but his eyes, dead serious. "We got a bet going on if you can. Make it out back with us without losing your nerve." I laugh it off, hoping they'll take the hint. Nah, I've got enough bets going with myself just getting through the night. But they don't drop it. One of them scoots out of the booth, practically blocking my path. "Oh, come on, we're just trying to have a little fun." I feel my heart pick up. The bar's empty. It's just me and them. I try to step back, but they fan out, surrounding me. I'm not even sure what they're betting on at this point, but the way they're looking at me, it feels like they're testing how far they can push before I break. "Look, I think it's time you guys head out," I say, trying to keep my voice steady. They just laugh. The big guy leans in, his face way too close, and I catch a whiff of stale beer on his breath. "It's just a game," he says, almost whispering. "Don't be a coward." My hands are clenched at my sides. I'm standing there trying to keep my cool, but inside I'm panicking. I don't want to end up out back with them or figure out what game they're talking about. Just then I spot the security camera above the bar. I don't know if it's actually recording, but I look right at it and say, loud enough for it to pick up, "All right, fellas, the place is closed. Time to call it a night." There's a pause, the guys exchanging glances. One of them, the quietest of the group, shifts nervously. "Come on, man," he mutters to his friend. "Let's go. This is stupid." The tension breaks. They grumble, cussing under their breath, but finally they shuffle out the door. I watch them through the window until they're down the street, heart pounding like crazy. I don't know what would have happened if they'd gone through with their bet. But I do know this: next time I hear anyone mention a wager around here, I'm calling backup. I've worked at this motel for 3 years, long enough to know the routine. Guests check in. Guests check out. Rooms get cleaned. Simple. Except for that one night. The night a housekeeper came in asking for a key and vanished. It was a slow night. Barely any check-ins, just a couple of long-term guests and a few truckers stopping over. I was behind the desk, half watching a show on my phone, when the lobby doors slid open. A woman in a housekeeping uniform stepped inside. Mid-40s, hair tucked into a bun, the standard maroon smock. Looked familiar, but I couldn't place her name. She gave me a tired smile. "Forgot my key," she said. "Can I get a spare?" This happened all the time. Our housekeeping staff used master keys, but sometimes they got misplaced. I barely looked up as I grabbed the key log. "Which room?" 206, she said, brushing snow off her sleeves. Left the key on the cart. I checked the system. 206 was empty, no guest checked in yet. I handed her the key. She took it with a nod of thanks and walked out. I thought nothing of it, until an hour later, when the real housekeeper walked in. Her name was Maria, one of the full-time cleaners. She was out of breath, cheeks red from the cold. "Hey, did someone turn in my key?" I frowned. "You asked for a spare earlier." She blinked. "No, I didn't." My stomach dropped. I pulled up the security feed, and there she was. The other woman, same uniform, same tired smile. But as I watched the footage, something hit me. Her face. It wasn't quite right. The proportions were off. Her mouth just a little too wide, her skin just a little too smooth. And as I stared at the screen, I realized something else. She never blinked. Not once. I scrolled through the footage. She walked into the hall and disappeared. She never left. Never checked out. Just vanished into room 206. I grabbed the key ring and ran to the hallway, Maria right behind me. My hands shook as I unlocked 206. The door swung open. The room was empty. No luggage, no coat, nothing. Except, on the bed, a housekeeping uniform, neatly folded, and next to it a key card. I turned it over. The room number was smudged out. Maria grabbed my arm, her voice barely above a whisper. "We don't wear maroon anymore," she said. I swallowed. She was right. The motel switched uniforms 5 years ago. Whoever I gave that key to, they weren't part of the staff, and they were never supposed to be here. Working the night shift in IT isn't what most people would call thrilling. It's mostly quiet, routine checks on systems, and monitoring the security feeds for an empty office building. I've been doing it for over a year now, and I've gotten used to the silence. Honestly, it can get pretty boring, just me, a dozen screens, and the hum of the server room. That night started out just like any other. I grabbed my usual cup of coffee, settled into my chair, and started my rounds of system checks. Everything was smooth, nothing out of the ordinary. The cameras showed the usual, a completely empty building. Sometimes I'd see the janitor doing his rounds, but other than that, nothing. Around 2 a.m., I noticed a flicker on one of the security feeds. At first, I didn't think much of it. The system can be glitchy sometimes, and a quick reset usually fixes it. But then it happened again, this time on a different camera. Another quick flicker, like static across the screen. I leaned forward, squinting at the monitor. Something was off. The flickering spread to other cameras one by one, until almost every feed had a brief flash of static. It wasn't normal, but I figured it was just a temporary issue. I pulled up the diagnostics, running a check to see if the system had encountered any errors. No alerts, no red flags. Weird. Then, as I was staring at the screen, I noticed something that made my heart skip. On one of the cameras, I saw a figure, just for a second, but it was there. Someone walking down the hallway on the 4th floor. Now, this building is supposed to be empty. I'm the only one here, and the janitor had already finished his rounds hours ago. I clicked on the feed, zooming in, but the figure had disappeared. The hallway was empty again. What the hell? I rewound the footage, playing it back frame by frame. And that's when I saw it. The figure looked like me. Same hair, same clothes. It was blurry, but the resemblance was uncanny. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. It's just a glitch, I told myself. The camera must have caught some kind of reflection or weird distortion. I went to the next camera in the sequence to see if it had picked up anything else, but as I clicked, the screen went black. My stomach tightened. I checked the other feeds, and one by one they all started to go down. All except one, the hallway leading to my office. The camera showed a figure again, walking slowly, step by step, getting closer to where I was sitting, and it was me. My throat went dry as I watched. The figure on the screen was walking down the exact hallway outside my office door, but when I looked at the live feed, there was no one there. The hallway was empty, but the camera showed her, or me, getting closer. I tried to breathe, but panic was creeping in fast. This isn't real. This can't be real. I looked over my shoulder at the door, half expecting to see the handle turn, but everything was still, quiet. Then I looked back at the screen. I was standing right outside the door. The camera showed her hand reaching for the handle, but the actual door stayed motionless. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Should I open the door? Should I run? Where could I even go? The figure on the screen turned her head, like she was looking directly into the camera, directly at me. I backed up, my legs hitting the edge of the desk. My hands were shaking and I couldn't pull my eyes away from the screen. What was happening? Was I losing it? Was this some kind of elaborate prank? I ran a hand through my hair, trying to think straight. Then the figure on the camera smiled. A slow, eerie smile that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't stay there. I grabbed my phone, yanked open the office door, and ran into the hallway. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness, and I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see her, me, following. But the hallway was empty. I rushed down the stairs, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I'd just seen. I had to get out of the building. I couldn't stay there. I sprinted through the lobby and slammed the door open, bursting out into the cold night air. I stood there panting, my breath fogging in front of me. The building loomed behind me, dark and silent as if nothing had happened. But I knew what I saw. I wasn't crazy. I couldn't have imagined that. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling as I dialed my boss. The phone rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. Great. I tried to calm myself down, but every time I closed my eyes I saw her, me, smiling through the camera, standing outside my door like she belonged there. I wasn't going back in. No way. The next morning I came back with my supervisor and told him everything. I showed him the footage, but of course it was gone. All of it. The glitches, the figure, everything. Like it had never happened. He gave me this weird look like I was making it all up, and I didn't blame him. I sounded crazy, but I knew what I saw. I couldn't explain it, but I wasn't going to forget it. I quit the night shift after that. Found a different job. One where I didn't have to sit alone in a dark office building with only security cameras for company. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about it. I wonder what would have happened if I had opened that door. If I, had stepped inside. And the worst part, I don't know if she's still in there, somewhere waiting. I don't know why I've become so obsessed with this story. Maybe it's the small town connection, or maybe it's the sheer mystery of it all. Either way, it keeps me up at night. It happened back in 1997, but if you ask anyone from around here, they'll still tell you about it like it was yesterday. The woman's name was Margaret Hayes. She wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Early 30s, worked at the local diner, kept to herself mostly. Her landlord, Mr. Grayson, said she always paid her rent on time, never caused any trouble. Just a quiet, small-town life, until the day she disappeared. It was her boss at the diner who first reported her missing. Margaret hadn't shown up for work, and no one could reach her. Her car was still parked outside her small duplex, but when Mr. Grayson went to check, the door was locked. At first, everyone assumed she'd just taken off without telling anyone. People do that sometimes, right? But then Mr. Grayson let himself in with a spare key to check on things. That's when things got strange. The apartment was clean. Too clean. Not in an obsessive way, but in a deliberate, almost staged way. There were no dishes in the sink, no laundry in the basket, and no signs of a struggle. Everything was perfectly in place, except for one thing. A VHS tape sitting dead center on the kitchen counter, like it had been left there on purpose. Mr. Grayson didn't know what to make of it, so he handed it over to the police. They popped it into a VCR right there in the station, probably thinking it was nothing, maybe a farewell message or something. But what they saw on that tape, well, it still gives me chills just thinking about it. The footage was grainy, like it had been recorded on one of those old camcorders people used in the 90s. It showed Margaret sitting on the floor of a small dark room. She was crying, her face streaked with tears, her hair a mess. She looked terrified. At one point, she begged for help, saying over and over, "Please, someone find me, please." But that wasn't the worst part. In the background of the video, you could hear it, this faint, almost inaudible laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was there, just barely audible under her sobs, and it didn't sound human. It was slow, deliberate, and hollow, like someone trying to mimic a laugh without any real emotion behind it. The police tore the town apart looking for her. They searched every abandoned building, every wooded area, every basement and crawl space, but they found nothing. No clues, no leads, no Margaret. It was like she'd been swallowed up by the earth. 2 weeks passed, and the case started to cool down. That's when the second tape showed up. This time, it wasn't left in her apartment. It was mailed directly to the police station. No return address, just a blank envelope with the tape inside. The footage was similar to the first, but worse. Margaret looked thinner, paler, her eyes sunken. She didn't cry this time. She just stared into the camera, trembling, as the same laugh echoed in the background. And then the tapes started coming annually. Every year, on the anniversary of her disappearance, a new tape would arrive. The footage never changed much. Margaret in that same dark room, looking worse each time. By the 5th year, she was barely recognizable. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin almost translucent. She didn't even move anymore. She just sat there staring into the lens as if she knew people were watching but couldn't do anything to help her. The laugh was always there too, faint but constant. The tapes stopped coming after 2002. The police station never figured out who sent them, where they were from, or even where they were filmed. The whole thing became a kind of urban legend. Some people think Margaret was kidnapped by someone local, someone who wanted to toy with the town. Others say it was something darker, something not human. And then there are those who believe she's still alive somewhere, trapped in that room, waiting for someone to find her. I've seen copies of the tapes. They're floating around online if you know where to look, though I wouldn't recommend it. There's something wrong about them. It's not just the content, it's the way they feel. Like the room Margaret's in doesn't quite exist in our reality. Like it's somewhere else entirely. Every time I drive past her old duplex, I think about that first tape, sitting on the counter like an invitation. Whoever, or whatever, did this wanted to be seen. They wanted to be remembered, and they succeeded. But the part that haunts me the most? In the last tape, right before it cuts off, Margaret finally speaks. Her voice is hoarse, barely a whisper, but you can make it out if you listen closely. She says, "It's not over." And I don't think it ever will be. I first noticed it 3 weeks ago. A white van, unmarked, unmoving. It always sat in the back corner of the lot, away from the lights, backed into a space that gave a perfect view of the motel entrance. At first I thought it belonged to a guest. We got plenty of sketchy people passing through. A white van wasn't exactly shocking, but after a few nights, I realized something. It never moved. I started paying attention. Every shift, around 11 p.m., I'd check the lot. The van was always there. Same spot. Same newspapers covering the windows. No license plate. No sign of life. At first I told myself it was harmless. Maybe an old maintenance van. Maybe someone living out of it. But I never saw anyone go in or out, and something about it made my skin crawl. Then one night I saw it. Movement. It was almost 1 a.m. when it happened. The lot was empty except for a few parked trucks. I was behind the desk, scrolling through my phone, when something made me look up. And for the first time in 3 weeks, the van moved. Just a slight shift. Like something inside had pressed against the door. I felt a prickle of fear. I waited, watching. And then, a hand. Just a flash of pale skin between the sheets of newspaper. Small, delicate, like someone was trying to get my attention. I grabbed my radio, my hands cold with sweat. "There's someone in that van," I said. My voice sounded too loud in the empty lobby. No response. I glanced at the security monitor, and that's when I saw it. The newspaper shifting, like something was struggling behind it, like someone was trying to push through. I didn't think. I grabbed the phone and dialed 911. The cops arrived fast. 2 cruisers, lights flashing, rolling up silent in the dark. I stayed inside as they approached the van, hands on their holsters. One knocked on the side. No answer. I held my breath. Then, the back doors burst open. I won't forget what I saw. A woman, bound, gagged, eyes wide with terror. Her wrists were raw from rope burns. Tears streamed down her face as they cut her loose, as she collapsed into one of the officer's arms. The cops pulled more from the van. A stack of missing persons posters, each one folded, worn, each one a different woman. And the worst part? The woman they pulled out? She wasn't on any of them. They never found him. The owner of the van, no fingerprints, no ID, no way to know how many other women had been in there before her. But sometimes late at night when the lot is empty and the motel is quiet, I wonder, how many times did she try to get someone's attention? How many people walked by and never saw her? And how many more vans are out there, just waiting in the dark? Working the night shift at a distribution warehouse wasn't exactly what I'd call a dream job, but it paid the bills. It was mindless, mostly. Just me, a few machines, and rows upon rows of shelves. It was the kind of place that stretched out forever in the dark, with the hum of forklifts and conveyor belts creating a steady background noise, that became almost soothing after a while. I'd been working there for about 6 months, and nothing out of the ordinary had ever happened. That is, until a few nights ago. It started like any other shift. I clocked in around 11 p.m., grabbed my scanner, and started my rounds. The warehouse was massive, with shelves that towered above you, filled with pallets of everything from electronics to canned goods. The lighting was dim, just enough to get by, but it always left the far ends of the aisles in shadows. The place was creepy at night, sure, but I'd gotten used to it. Around 2 a.m., though, I heard it, a noise from the far end of the building. At first, I shrugged it off. This was an old warehouse, after all, and strange noises weren't uncommon. The place had rats, the machines would groan, and sometimes the wind would rattle the loading docks. I figured it was just one of those things. But as the shift dragged on, the noises didn't stop. They got louder. Every so often I'd hear what sounded like metal clanging or something being knocked over. It was coming from one of the back aisles where the lights barely reached. I told myself it was probably a pallet shifting or something minor, but deep down, it started to bother me. After hearing it for the 5th or 6th time, I grabbed my flashlight and decided to check it out. Big mistake. I walked toward the back of the warehouse, shining my light down the aisles as I passed them. Everything looked normal, just boxes stacked high, like always. But when I got to the last row where the noise had come from, I noticed something off. One of the shelves, one of the big metal ones, had a dent in it, like something heavy had slammed into it. My first thought was a forklift had hit it, but there hadn't been any other workers on shift with me. I was completely alone. The noise came again, closer this time. It was a scraping sound, like metal dragging on concrete. My flashlight beam flickered as I swung it around, trying to pinpoint the source. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darting between the shelves. I froze. For a second I thought I was just seeing things. It was late, and my brain was probably playing tricks on me. But then I saw it again. A dark shape moving quickly like it was running from aisle to aisle. My heart started pounding. I told myself it had to be one of the rats, or maybe even a stray dog that had gotten inside. But as I stood there, the noise came again, louder this time, and I could swear I heard something breathing. I decided to head back to the main part of the warehouse, where the light was better, and maybe call someone to come check it out. But as I turned to leave, I heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps, coming toward me. Panic hit me. I started walking faster, trying not to break into a run, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. Every time I passed an aisle, I'd catch a glimpse of movement, just out of the corner of my eye. It wasn't a rat, and it wasn't a dog. Whatever it was big. I reached the main floor, where the lights were brighter, and stopped to catch my breath. For a few minutes, everything was quiet again. Maybe I was just overreacting. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Then, the lights went out. Every single one of them. The hum of the machine stopped, and the entire warehouse was plunged into darkness. My flashlight flickered once, then twice, and then went dead. I was alone in the pitch black, in the middle of a warehouse the size of a football field with no idea where the breaker was. And somewhere out there I could still hear those footsteps. I backed up against one of the shelves, trying to calm down, but it was no use. The fear hit me hard. I couldn't see a thing, and the footsteps were getting closer. I didn't know what was out there, but it was coming for me. My phone. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight app. The weak light barely penetrated the darkness, but it was better than nothing. I started making my way toward the office where the breaker room was. If I could just get the power back on, maybe I'd be able to see what the hell was going on. But as I moved, the footsteps followed. I shone my phone's light around, trying to see something, anything. But all I saw were the endless rows of shelves, towering over me like silent giants. The footsteps were so close now that I could hear the shuffle of shoes on the concrete floor. Whatever was following me wasn't far behind. I picked up the pace, practically running at this point, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was almost to the office when I heard it, a low, raspy whisper right behind me. "Where are you going?" I spun around, my phone light flickering, and for a split second I saw it. A figure, tall, hunched with long, gangly limbs. Its face was obscured by shadows, but I could see its eyes, wide, staring right at me. I didn't think. I just ran. I bolted into the office, slamming the door behind me, and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold my phone. I stood there, in the dark, listening to the sound of footsteps right outside the door. For what felt like hours, I waited. The footsteps eventually faded, but I wasn't about to go back out there. I stayed locked in the office until my shift ended, my back pressed against the door, every muscle tense. When the morning crew came in, they found me still sitting there, my eyes wide, phone clutched in my hand. I told them what happened, but they just laughed it off, saying I was probably just tired or imagining things. But I know what I saw, and I'll never forget that voice. Night shifts at motels are boring. It's just a lot of sitting, watching the clock, maybe checking in the occasional late-night guest. Most of the time I just scroll through my phone, half listening to the hum of the vending machine. That's why when the 911 dispatcher called, I thought it was a prank. It wasn't. It was just after 2 a.m. when the phone rang. "Front desk," I answered, barely looking up from my screen. A woman's voice came through, low and urgent. "This is 911 dispatch. We received a distress call from your location. A woman reported being attacked in the public restroom." I sat up straight. "What?" "The call came from the payphone inside the restroom." I frowned. "We don't have a payphone in the restroom." Silence. Then, click. The dispatcher hung up. I sat there for a moment, heartbeat thudding in my ears. There was only one public restroom in the motel, near the vending machines outside. We kept it locked at night, only guests could get a key. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out. The wind cut through my jacket as I stepped into the cold. The parking lot was empty except for a few trucks and an old sedan. The neon motel sign buzzed overhead, casting a dull red glow over the pavement. I reached the bathroom door, locked, just like it should be. Still, I knocked. "Hello? Anyone in there?" No response. I pulled out the master key and turned the handle. The door swung open, the lights were off, the stall doors stood open. Empty. No signs of a struggle, no blood, and definitely no payphone. But the air felt wrong, like the space had been occupied just moments ago. I shone my flashlight around, then stopped. The mirror. Something was written on it, fogged over like someone had breathed on the glass and traced letters into the mist. One word. Help. I backed away, heart hammering. That's when I saw the security camera. Back in the lobby, I pulled up the footage. The camera outside the restroom door showed an empty sidewalk stretching all the way back to the vending machines. I fast-forwarded. Nothing. Then, movement. At 1:47 a.m., the bathroom door creaked open. Not pushed, not forced, just slowly swung outward, like someone was leaving. But there was no one there. I stared, fingers tightening around the mouse. The door opened on its own, and then right before it closed again, a shadow moved. Not a person, just a dark shape, flickering at the edge of the frame. And for the briefest second, the camera glitched. When it cleared, the bathroom door was shut. The timestamp read 1:48 a.m., 12 minutes before 911 called. I didn't sleep the next morning. I stayed late and checked the records. The last payphone we had? We removed it 3 years ago, but I found something else. A police report, filed exactly 3 years ago to the day. A woman had gone missing, last seen in that restroom. She made a 911 call before vanishing. The report never said what she told them, only that the dispatcher heard her scream, and then the line went dead. I don't check the restroom at night anymore. I don't answer calls from unknown numbers, and every year, on this exact night, at exactly 2 a.m., the bathroom door swings open, and the mirror fogs over. One word. Help! So imagine this. It's a packed Friday night. The bar is buzzing, music thumping, people laughing, drinks flowing. I'm behind the bar, pouring shots, cracking jokes, trying to keep up with orders flying in left and right. We're at full capacity and the energy is wild. Should have been a fun night, right? Well, that's when things went south. Just as I'm reaching for a bottle, the lights cut out. Complete blackout. Everything just stops. Mid-laugh, mid-song, mid-sip. The place goes from chaos to dead silence in a split second. And all I can hear are people muttering, "What the hell?" and nervous laughs floating through the dark. You'd think someone had just flipped the off switch on the entire bar. At first I laugh it off, figuring someone tripped a breaker or something. I shout, "Hang tight, folks!" But I can't see a damn thing. Not the people around me, not even my own hand in front of my face. The emergency lights didn't come on and it's pitch black, the kind of darkness that makes your skin crawl. And then, I feel it. Someone brushes past me. Close. Like way too close for a crowded bar. It's subtle, but I feel this hand, first just brushing against my arm, then gripping my side for a split second. I whip around, but of course I can't see anything. I think it's one of my co-workers or maybe a customer who lost their balance. But before I can make sense of it, I hear this whisper. Right in my ear, like someone leaning in, lips almost grazing my cheek. It's so soft, like they're trying to be quiet but close enough that I can feel their breath. I can't make out what they're saying. It's more like a mumble, almost chanting, a sound that sends shivers down my spine. And then I feel another hand. This time it's rougher, pressing against my back, and before I can react, it's gone. Like whoever it was slipped back into the darkness. I freeze, heart racing, trying to figure out what's going on. I want to shout, call out for help, but my voice catches in my throat. It's like I'm paralyzed. More whispers. Close. Too close. They feel like they're coming from everywhere around me. And then, another brush against my side. Someone's fingers trailing along my arm before vanishing. I'm spinning in the dark, trying to keep track of what's happening, but it's impossible. There's no one there, and yet there's definitely someone there. And then, thank God, the lights flicker back on. The entire bar lights up, the music cuts back in, and I can finally see. I'm looking around, wide-eyed, expecting to find someone standing right there next to me. But nothing. Just the usual crowd. People laughing, talking like nothing happened. The energy picks right back up, like the blackout was just a hiccup. But I'm standing there, frozen, completely rattled. My coworkers come over, asking if I'm okay, and I just nod, trying to shake it off. But I can still feel where those hands were, that rough grip on my back, the fingers that brushed down my arm. It was real, I know it was. And those whispers, they're still echoing in my head, even though I couldn't understand a word. The story of Michael Connors still gets whispered about in late-night conversations at that office. I don't work there, but I've heard the accounts from people who do, and honestly, it's enough to keep you looking over your shoulder in any quiet building. Back in 2003, Connors was a well-known private investigator. Not flashy, not like the ones you see on TV, but thorough. If you had a problem and needed answers, he was your guy. At the time, he was working on a high-stakes corporate fraud case involving some big players in the finance world. The kind of case that could ruin reputations, bankrupt companies, maybe even put people in jail. From what I've gathered, Connors was getting close to something. Too close. It was a Friday night when he disappeared. Security footage shows him walking into his office at 10:17 p.m. He looked normal. No signs of stress, no one following him. He used his key to get in, shut the door behind him, and that was it. The cameras never caught him leaving. When his assistant showed up the next morning, the door was locked from the inside. She knocked, waited, knocked again. Nothing. Eventually, she got the building manager to unlock it, thinking maybe Connors had fallen asleep or something. What they found? It still gives me chills just recounting it. The office was untouched. His jacket was draped over the back of his chair, his coffee cup half full and still warm. His files were spread out on the desk, like he'd been going through them when something interrupted him. But there was one strange detail. A folder with the words, "Do not ignore," written in bold red marker was missing. The assistant swore she'd seen it there the day before. No signs of struggle, no signs of Connors. It was like he had just vanished. The police were called, of course. They dusted for prints, searched the building, checked the security tapes over and over. Nothing. The case went cold fast. Theories ranged from a pre-planned disappearance, maybe Connors had gotten too deep and went into hiding, to something more sinister, like someone in the case making sure he never got to reveal what he'd found. And then the report started. A few months after his disappearance, employees working late started hearing things over the office intercom system. At first, it was just static, easily dismissed as a malfunction, but then people started hearing a voice. "Help me." That's what they said it said. Faint and distorted, like someone speaking from far away. Other times, it was just his name, Connors. I know what you're thinking, probably a prank, right? But here's the thing. The intercom system had been disconnected a week after Connors vanished. The company claimed it was just outdated and no longer needed. So where was the voice coming from? One janitor, a guy named Luis, said he heard the voice while cleaning late one night. It called his name, clear as day, and when he turned around, every single light in the office went out. He quit the next morning and refused to talk about it again. Then there were the files. A new employee found a folder in the office archive room almost a year later. It wasn't labeled with a case number or anything official. It just had those same words. "Do not ignore." The employee swears they didn't know about Connors' case at the time. They opened it, read a few pages, and then bolted out of the building. They wouldn't say what was in it, only that it was beyond dangerous. The folder disappeared again before anyone else could see it. To this day, Connor's disappearance remains unsolved. The building has changed hands a few times, but the rumors persist. People still report hearing his voice, seeing his shadow in the hallway, or feeling a cold draft when they walk past his old office, room 314. And that folder? It's never stayed hidden for long. It always finds its way back into circulation, almost like Connors is still trying to get someone, anyone, to finish what he started. If you ever find yourself working late in a quiet office and you hear a voice on the intercom, don't answer. And whatever you do, if you see a folder marked "Do Not Ignore," ignore it. Every motel has one room that no one stays in. Maybe it's due to renovations, maybe there was a crime, maybe it's just bad luck. For us, it was room 212, bolted shut, no key, no guests, just an empty, forgotten space at the end of the hall. At least that's what we thought. Until the night a guest called asking why someone was pacing inside. It was just after midnight when the call came through. "Front desk," I answered, half distracted. A woman's voice, nervous. "Hi, I don't mean to bother you, but..." A pause, then, "There's someone in the room next to mine." I frowned. "Which room are you in?" 211, she said. "Second floor." My stomach tightened, because room 212 was empty. I pulled up the system just to double check. Room 212, vacant. I swallowed. "Are you sure? No one's been in that room for years." Another pause. Then, softer. "I can hear them, walking." I grabbed the master key and headed upstairs. The hall was silent, just the dull hum of the vending machine and the faint buzz of the exit sign. I stepped past room 211, stopped in front of 212, and listened. At first, nothing. Then, a single slow footstep. My breath hitched. Another. Pacing. Inside a room that should have been empty. I knocked. The footsteps stopped. My pulse pounded in my ears. "Front desk," I called out. "Is someone in there?" Silence. I tried the handle, still bolted shut. I reached for my radio. "Hey, can we get maintenance to..." Then, the doorknob twisted. From the inside, I jumped back. My breath fogged in the air. The temperature had dropped, the hallway suddenly freezing. Then, a whisper, low, right against the door. "Let me out." I turned and ran. Back at the desk, I checked the security footage. The hallway cam showed me standing outside the door, knocking, stepping back, then the doorknob turning, on its own. I felt my stomach twist, because in the reflection of the exit sign, I saw it. A figure standing just inside the room, tall, watching. Its face was wrong, like it wasn't meant to be seen. I told my manager the next morning. He didn't even look surprised, just shook his head and said, "That room was never supposed to be opened." I asked why. He just said, "Forget about it." I tried. But that night, as I was locking up, I passed room 212, and for just a second, I swear I saw the doorknob move. The room is still bolted shut. No key, no guests, just an empty, forgotten space. At least that's what we tell people. But every now and then, a guest will call asking about the footsteps next door. And I always say the same thing. That room is empty, even though I know it isn't. I first heard about the Forest of Forgotten Names from a guy I met in college. His name was Trevor, and he was one of those conspiracy theory junkies who could turn even the most innocent news story into something sinister. But this one wasn't like the rest. When Trevor talked about this forest, he didn't smirk or crack a joke like he usually did. He just said, "Some places don't want you there," and left it at that. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic, but now I wish I'd listened. The story goes that in 2015, 3 college friends, Jen, Marcus, and Caleb, went hiking in a remote forest somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. It wasn't on any official trail map, just one of those spots people talk about in whispers, a place locals warn you to stay away from. The forest didn't even have a real name, just a nickname people used online, the Forest of Forgotten Names. According to their families, the 3 friends were experienced hikers. They had all the right gear, a detailed itinerary, and even a backup plan in case something went wrong. But none of that mattered. They vanished without a trace. Well, almost without a trace. 2 days after they were reported missing, search and rescue teams found Caleb's phone. It was lying in the middle of a clearing, completely undamaged, as if someone had gently placed it there. There was no sign of the hikers, no footprints leading to or from the spot. Just that phone. What they found on it still haunts me. The video starts off normal enough. You see Jen holding the camera, laughing and making fun of Marcus for tripping over a root. Caleb's voice is in the background, joking about how they'll all go viral if they fall into a bear trap. It's the kind of carefree, dumb stuff you'd expect from a group of friends on a hike. But then, about a minute in, something shifts. The laughter stops. The camera starts shaking as Jen spins around trying to capture something in the trees. Marcus asks, "Did you hear that?" Caleb tells him to relax, but his voice wavers. Jen zooms in on a cluster of trees. At first it looks like nothing, just shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. But then you notice them. Figures, standing perfectly still, half hidden among the trees. They aren't moving, but they aren't natural either. Their shapes are wrong, too tall, too thin. And even though the camera never gets close enough to show faces, you can tell they're watching. The video cuts out for a few seconds, and when it comes back, it's chaos. The 3 of them are running. The camera's bouncing so you can't see much, but you can hear Caleb shouting, "Stay together!" while Marcus yells something incoherent. Jen is crying, muttering, "They're not real, they're not real." And then, silence. The camera steadies, and you see the 3 of them standing in a circle, facing outward like they're trying to protect themselves from something. They're mumbling. At first it sounds like gibberish, but if you listen closely you can hear fragments of words. Names. Over and over they're repeating names. And those figures? They're closer now. Dozens of them surrounding the friends, still, perfectly silent. The final frame is the worst. Jen points the camera at herself. Her face is pale, her eyes wide with terror. She leans in close and whispers, "Don't let them take our names." The screen goes black. That's where the story should end, but it doesn't. When the authorities tried to identify the hikers, something bizarre happened. Their names were gone. not just from the video, but from every official record, birth certificates, school transcripts, social media accounts. Even their families couldn't find old photos or keepsakes with their names on them. It was like they'd been erased, scrubbed clean from existence. The media picked up the story for a while, dubbing it the Vanishing Names case. But without solid evidence, it fizzled out. People moved on. Except for Trevor. He became obsessed with the case, diving into forums and digging up every rumor he could find about the forest. He told me that names have power, that taking someone's name is like taking their identity, their soul. I didn't believe him until last week. I was cleaning out an old hard drive when I found a folder labeled FOFN. Inside was a single file, the video. Trevor must have given it to me at some point, though I don't remember him doing it. Out of morbid curiosity, I watched it again. And now, I can't stop hearing my name. It's faint, just a whisper on the edge of my hearing, but it's there. Always there. In the wind, in the hum of my fridge, in the static of my TV. I don't know what to do, but I can tell you this. Don't go looking for the forest of forgotten names. And if you do, don't let them take yours. I've worked in retail for a few years now, mostly night shifts. It's not my dream job, but it pays the bills. Closing up the store at the end of the day is usually routine. You shut off the lights, count the register, lock the doors, nothing to it. But that night was different. It was nearing 11 p.m., and I was getting ready to close up. The store was mostly quiet, just the hum of the air conditioning and the soft, generic music playing over the speakers. I was doing my final rounds through the aisles, making sure everything was in order. We hadn't had many customers that evening, just a handful of people coming in and out. But then, as I made my way to the back of the store, I saw him, a man lingering in the aisles. I hadn't noticed him before. He wasn't shopping, wasn't browsing. He was just standing there, staring at one of the shelves. He looked out of place, wearing a heavy coat even though it wasn't cold out. My stomach twisted a little, but I shook it off. I walked over, forcing a polite smile. "Excuse me, sir. We're closing in a few minutes." He didn't move, didn't even look at me, just kept staring at the shelf like he hadn't heard a word I said. I cleared my throat, stepping a little closer. "Sir, we're about to close. You'll need to leave soon." Still nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. Something about him didn't sit right. I was used to customers lingering a bit too long, but this guy? He was giving off a weird vibe. "Okay. I'll give you a few more minutes," I mumbled, backing away. I figured I'd finish up the rest of my closing duties and check back on him later. Maybe he'd get the hint and leave on his own. I headed to the front of the store, starting to shut off the lights. I glanced at the security monitor, keeping an eye on the guy. But when I looked back at the feed, he wasn't there anymore. The aisle was empty. I checked the other cameras, flicking through them one by one, but he was nowhere to be seen. My heart started to race. There was no way he could have left that quickly without me noticing. Where the hell did he go? I stood there staring at the monitor, trying to make sense of it. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed. I pulled it out of my pocket and saw a notification from the store's security system. Front door opened. I glanced up at the front door. It was still closed. Locked. No one had come in or gone out. I checked the security feed again, but the front door camera showed nothing, just an empty entrance. The uneasy feeling was growing stronger by the second. Maybe he left through the back, I thought, but even that didn't make sense. The back door had a security alarm that would have gone off if anyone tried to open it, and it hadn't. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was late, I was tired, and maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe he'd slipped out while I wasn't paying attention, and the system was just glitching. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, like something scraping against the floor. It was coming from the bathroom. My pulse quickened as I walked toward the sound, every step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got, the more my instincts screamed at me to turn around, to leave. But I couldn't. I had to check. I had to know. I pushed open the bathroom door, my heart pounding in my chest. The lights flickered as I stepped inside, casting eerie shadows on the tiled walls. The room was empty, or so I thought. Then I saw it. Written on the mirror in what looked like red lipstick were the words, "I'm still here." I felt the blood drain from my face. My first thought was that it was some kind of prank, but as I stood there staring at the message, a cold realization crept over me. This wasn't a joke. The man hadn't left. He was still in the store somewhere, watching me. I backed out of the bathroom, my eyes darting around the store. Every shadow, every corner seemed to hold something sinister. I grabbed my phone, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. As I waited for the operator to pick up, I heard it again, that scraping sound. But this time, it was closer. Too close. I ran to the front of the store, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't care about closing up or locking the doors anymore. I just needed to get out. I needed to leave. The second I hit the pavement outside, the cool night air hit me, and I could finally breathe. I kept running until I was a few blocks away, only stopping when I felt like I was far enough from the store. When the police arrived, they searched the entire building, but they didn't find anyone. No sign of the man. No sign of anything suspicious, except for the message on the mirror. They told me it was probably a prank, maybe a disgruntled customer trying to scare me. But I knew better. I knew what I'd heard. I knew what I'd seen. It was just before midnight when he walked in. I had already started closing out the register, getting ready for the end of my shift. We weren't one of those places with 24-hour service. By 12:30, the doors locked, and anyone who needed a room was out of luck. But this guy? He insisted. He stepped inside, shaking the snow from his coat. Tall, lean, too still. His clothes were clean, but something about him felt off. He walked straight to the counter, sliding a wad of cash across the desk. "One night," he said. "No receipt." I hesitated. "Need an ID." He pulled out a driver's license. I barely glanced at it before my stomach tightened. It was fake. I couldn't say how I knew. Maybe it was the way the laminate curled at the edges, or how the picture looked a little too smooth, like it had been copied one too many times. I should have turned him away. But something about the way he was staring at me, unblinking, made my skin crawl. So I nodded, took the cash, and handed him a key. "Room 108, I said. He smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile you wanted to see. The rest of the shift was uneventful. No calls, no complaints. But something bothered me. I checked the security feed around 3 a.m. The camera in the hallway showed his door, 108, still shut. But every time I checked, I noticed the peephole was dark, like he was standing just on the other side, watching. The next morning, housekeeping screamed. I ran down the hall, heart hammering. The door to 108 was wide open. Inside, the bed was untouched, not just unmade, untouched. The pillows still fluffed, the sheets still perfectly smooth, like no one had slept there at all. And in the bathroom, the sink was full of knives, 6 of them, each one lined up perfectly, each one freshly cleaned. I backed out of the room, my pulse slamming in my ears. I checked the security footage. The camera outside 108 showed him entering the room at 12:03 a.m. But here's the thing, he never came out. I called the cops. They found nothing, no fingerprints, no luggage. The knives wiped clean, no prints, no blood, like they'd never been used. The ID he gave me didn't match anyone. As far as records were concerned, the man who checked into room 108 never existed. I still worked the night shift, and every time a guest checks in late, alone in cash with no bags, I wonder, is it him? Is he coming back? And if he does, what will he bring next time? I've dealt with a lot as a landlord, Late payments, trashed properties, even the occasional tenant who just disappears in the middle of the night. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened with apartment 3C. It wasn't just bizarre, it was horrifying. The tenant Alan moved in a little over a year ago. Seemed like a decent guy. Quiet, mid-30s, worked from home, paid rent on time. Honestly, I didn't think twice about him. He kept to himself, no loud parties, no complaints from the neighbors. If anything, he was the kind of tenant every landlord hopes for. But about 6 months into his lease, Alan started sending emails. At first, they were minor complaints. Stuff like the water pressure in the shower being weak or the fridge making a strange noise. Nothing out of the ordinary, so I handled it quickly and thought that was that. Then the tone of his emails changed. He started complaining about feeling sick all the time, headaches, nausea, difficulty breathing. He was convinced the apartment was to blame. Specifically, he said it was mold. He'd attached photos of what looked like small dark spots near the air vents, claiming the entire system was contaminated. I had the place inspected immediately, and the technician assured me there was no mold, just some harmless dust buildup. I passed that information along to Alan, thinking it would put his mind at ease. But it didn't. If anything, it made things worse. The emails became more frequent, more frantic. Alan was convinced the apartment was poisoning him. He started missing rent payments, saying he couldn't work because he was so sick. When I called to discuss the situation, he accused me of neglect and threatened to sue. I tried to reason with him, even offered to let him break the lease and move out, but he refused. He said he wouldn't leave until I fixed the toxic air vents. Then, about 3 months ago, Alan stopped responding entirely. No emails, no calls, no payments. I assumed he'd finally decided to move out, so I started the eviction process. A week before the court date, I got a call from one of the neighbors. She said she hadn't seen Alan in weeks and was worried something might have happened to him. My stomach sank. I went to the apartment immediately, knocked on the door, and when there was no answer, I used my spare key to let myself in. The smell hit me first, pungent, chemical, almost metallic. It made my eyes water and my throat burn. I called out for Alan, but there was no response. The place was a mess. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, garbage overflowing, windows sealed shut with duct tape. And then, in the bedroom, I found him. Alan was slumped in a chair, motionless, pale. A mask covered his face, one of those industrial respirators you see on construction sites. At first I thought he was asleep, but as I got closer, it became clear he wasn't breathing. I called 911, but it was too late. Alan was dead. The coroner ruled it as respiratory failure due to prolonged exposure to hazardous chemicals. At the time, they assumed it was accidental. Maybe he'd been using cleaning products in an enclosed space and hadn't ventilated properly. But something about it didn't sit right with me. After the police cleared the apartment, I went back to clean it out. That's when I noticed the vents. They were coated in a strange, sticky residue, yellowish and foul-smelling. It didn't look like mold. I called the same technician who had inspected the vents months earlier, and when he opened the system, he found several plastic containers hidden inside, each filled with a viscous, toxic substance. The air circulation had been spreading the fumes throughout the apartment for weeks, maybe months. I was horrified. Who would do something like this? And then it hit me. Alan. The containers weren't there during the initial inspection, which meant someone had placed them afterward. The technician even found fingerprints on the lids. I went through Alan's emails again, looking for clues, and one phrase stood out: "I'm going to make sure you pay for this." At the time, I'd thought he was talking about suing me. But now, it seemed like he had a much darker plan. He must have been trying to create evidence of a toxic apartment, evidence he could use in a lawsuit. But in his desperation, he'd poisoned himself instead. The police reopened the case after I turned over the evidence. They confirmed that Alan had purchased the chemicals online and that the containers matched his fingerprints. It was ruled a case of accidental self-harm, and I was cleared of any responsibility. But the whole thing left me shaken. I replaced the entire ventilation system, scrubbed the apartment from top to bottom, and even hired a priest to bless the place. Not because I'm particularly religious, but because I couldn't shake the feeling that something dark still lingered there. To this day, I can't walk past apartment 3C without feeling a chill. Alan's death was tragic, but the worst part is knowing it didn't have to happen. Whatever demons he was fighting, they consumed him and left their mark on that apartment forever.